Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. In this exercise, we're going to focus on functions and variables. And as always, you can find the link to the current exercise in the description below. Since this is part of the paid section of the book, you would actually have to buy the book, or alternatively, of course, feel free to just follow along. So in the last exercise, we focused on functions and we learned on how we can define functions and how we can call them. And in this exercise, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into functions and also how we can use functions with variables. So in the last exercise, we defined a number of different functions and then called them afterwards. But there was one aspect that we didn't really cover in detail. And that was that the variables in our function are not connected to the variables in our script. So let's cover that in this exercise, and as always we're going to get started by typing out the code provided here in the exercise. So here we have our terminal. We can navigate to the appropriate folder and then you can type out for example code for opening the new Python file in Visual Studio Code, followed by the name of the exercise. So in this case exercise 19.py. And this is going to open a new Python file here in Visual Studio Code. Let's get started by first of all defining the first function here by again using def as the keyword in the beginning and then followed by the name of the function. And again, we are not allowed to start our function with a number. We would start it with a letter or with an underscore. And once we provided the name, we can then add the parameters, which we later on will call using the arguments. So here in this case, we're going to use two parameters as input, cheese count and boxes of crackers. And after we close the parentheses, of course, we add a colon. Now we add 4 spaces. And we continue with a print statement using printf. And we can use printf, of course, to actually render the input of the arguments that we are going to provide. So here we're going to print out you have cheese count cheeses. In the next line we can continue with printf. And here we print out the boxes of crackers. Let me just adjust this typo here. Like this. Next, we're going to print out basically 2 lines without printf. That's enough for a party, and then get a blanket. And here at the end, we add \n to add a new line at the very end. Alright, once we define this function, we can end it by basically going back and not indenting our code anymore. Instead, we print out a print statement. We can just give the function numbers directly. So here we call our function using the name of the function, and then we directly add 2 numbers, so 20 and 30. So cheese count here would actually be the first argument that we provide. So the 20 will be associated with this cheese count and the 30 will be associated with boxes of crackers. So that's the first way that we can use to call our function, by directly entering those numbers as arguments. Alternatively, we can use variables from our script. So here we would first of all define some variables, for example amount of cheese, and we can set that to 10, and amount of crackers, and let's set that to 50. And now again we can call our function cheese and crackers, and instead of directly providing the numbers, we would enter in here the variables that we defined as arguments. So amount of cheese and amount of crackers. And that of course corresponds to 10 and 50 respectively. We can, as an alternative, even do some calculations within our function. So again, we would enter the name of the function, and now we can basically say, instead of directly adding a number, we add 10 plus 20, so 30 as the first argument here for cheese count, and then as the second argument 5 plus 6, so 11, and that also works. And we can even go ahead and we can combine the two. So variables as well as calculations, as well as math. So here we can say cheese and crackers, amount of cheese plus 100. So that's the variable we defined before, and we add 100 to it, and then amount of crackers plus 1000. So again, that would be the variable 50 plus the 1000. That would be the total value which we pass to our function here. So that basically shows all the different ways that we are able to give our function the values that it needs to print. We can give it numbers, we can give it variables, we can give it some calculations, some math that we want to perform, and we can even combine it. As we saw here at the end, we can use variables and then do calculations on top of that. And in a way, the arguments to a function are kind of like our equal character when we make a variable, which we use to assign a value to a variable, as we did here. And usually, if we can use the equals character to name something, we can typically pass it to a function as an argument. All right, so let's save this real quick and go back to our terminal. And here we can now execute our code by typing in the version of Python, followed by the name of the Python file, so exercise19.py. All right, and so we got quite a bunch of output here. So again, since we call the function a total of 4 times here, we basically get 16 lines in total, which are printed out because each function call basically prints out 4 lines. The first one here is the one where we actually called the function directly by passing 2 different arguments to it, which were numbers, so 20 and 30. So we can see we have 20 cheeses and 30 boxes of crackers, and that's basically printed out here to us. The second statement that we use, the second function call here, was the one where we used those variables that we passed to the function, and then those variables, of course, were assigned certain numbers, so 10 and 50 in this case. And again, that's of course replaced here in our function call and is printed out. The third print statement here and the third function call is the one where we did some math. So we added 10 and 20 as the input, so 30 and 5 and 6 to get 11, and again that's rendered here. And finally, the last example was the one where we combined variables that we defined before, and then we added some additional values to them. So here we added 100 to amount of cheese to get a total value of 10 plus 100, 110 cheeses, and then amount of crackers, which we set to 50. We add 1000 to it, so we have 1050 boxes of crackers, which is quite a bit. So that's basically how we can use functions and how we can pass arguments in different forms to it to basically provide it to the function and to either maybe do some calculations when we pass it to the function, or by simply providing direct values or using some variables. So let's take a look at the study drills section here. So the first one is we should go back to our script and type a comment above each line expressing in English what it does. So if we go here to the very top, the first line is basically the function definition. So here what we do is we define the function cheese and crackers with 2 parameters. So we have to later on use 2 arguments to actually call the function. And then within this function here, let me just add that on top as well. So inside of the function, we use arguments, the arguments that we provide within print statements to print this out. Next, we add a print statement here, and then we call our function with numbers as arguments. So we directly pass it to it. That was the first example. Next, we defined 2 variables. And we also assigned them numbers, whole numbers, integers. And after that, a little bit down here, we call the function with variables as arguments, as the input here. Next, after the print statement here, we call our function and we pass basically some calculation to it as an argument. So that would then be processed by our function. And finally, we, after this print statement, call our function and then we pass variables or we pass a calculation with variables and integers to it. All right, so that's the steps we took here. Next study Doodle question, start at the bottom and read each line backwards, saying all the important characters. All right, so if we start here at the very bottom, what we first did is we called our function here and we provided 2 arguments. The first one here was the sum of the variable amount of cheese and the integer, the whole value 100. And the second argument, again, another variable amount of crackers, and we add 1000, another whole number to it. Above that, of course, we had a print statement, and here we have the previous function call. Here we call the function and we directly pass, again, 2 arguments, of course, and in this case here we have an addition. We add an integer value of 10 to an integer value of 20. Then we separate the second argument using a comma, and we add 5 to 6. And again, we pass that to the function to be printed out. In the previous function call here, we directly passed the different variables to that. And of course, we needed to define the variables before that. And we set them to an integer value, to a value of 10 for amount of cheese, and to a value of 50 for amount of crackers. And here we have the first function call, where we directly call our function and we pass 2 integers to our function, the value of 20 and the value to 30. And in order to do all of that, in order to be able to actually call our function, of course we needed to define it at the top here. Here we use the def keyword followed by a space and then the name of the function to actually set up our function. And we added 2 parameters to it, which we later on used to pass some arguments, some input to our function to work with it. Now, the first value here, the first parameter, is being used in the print statement here. We're using printf in order to be able to actually render the input of our argument here within that print statement. So here we used the curly braces to actually print that out. In the second line, the second print statement, we basically did the same thing, but instead of using the first argument here inside of it when we call it, or the first parameter when we define it, we used the second parameter, boxes of crackers, inside of this print statement. And the third and the fourth line are basically always the same, independent of the input that we provide, because we are not using any variables in here. We're using the regular print statement, not printf, to render anything, to embed any variables, but just to purely put out the print. the string statement. All right, and the final study drill exercise here is to write at least one more function of our own design and run it in 10 different ways. So to do that, let me just briefly comment out the code here by pressing Command and forward slash. And now we can define a new function. So for example, we can say we call it add2numbers, and we call this first input that we take number 1 and the second number 2. Again, we hit the colon, and then we make sure that we have 4 spaces here. And we can, for example, say we are going to do that very simply. We're going to provide, we're going to use printf, and here we can say number 1. I'm going to add number 1 plus number 2 equals, and then in here we can say, for example, going to return number 1 plus number 2. Actually, let's just remove this here, so we just print out number 1 plus number 2 equals, and then the sum of those numbers. And let's do it actually a little bit better. We can directly, instead of typing out number 1 and number 2, we can render number 1 and number 2, then we see the calculation here, and we can use it as sort of a calculator. So here we have number 1 plus number 2 equals number 1 plus number 2, so the sum of the two values. And now we can call it or run it in 10 different ways. So first of all, of course, we can, for example, add a value of 1 and 9 to it, so we can directly provide some values to it. As an alternative, of course, we could already add some values in here, so 1 plus 2 and, for example, 3 plus 7, this would be our input. We can, instead of using plus here, we can of course also subtract the values, so 5 minus 2, for example, and then let's say 2 minus 1. And of course we don't have to separate this into adding and subtracting both arguments. We can also combine the two, so we could say, for example, here we want to add the first 2 numbers for as the first argument, and then we're going to subtract 2 values for the second argument. Then after that, let's just define 2 variables. I'm going to call it number 1. Let's use a value of 3, and then number 2. And let's assign it a value of 8. And again, we can call add2numbers. And let's first of all just provide those 2 variables as arguments here. And then of course we can combine that. So we could, for example, say we're gonna add number 1 plus number 2 as the first argument, and then maybe number 2 minus number 1 as the second argument. We can also go ahead and let's say, for example, we want to take number 1 and add a value of 5 to it. And then we're gonna take number 2 and we add, let's say, 2 to it. And of course we can also do that and subtract some numbers, so for example minus 1, and then number 2 minus 3, let's say. And finally, let's say, for example, we add number 1 plus number 1 plus number 2. So first argument, we can really add as many statements as we'd like. And then let's say 31 plus 2 as a second argument here. Let's save this, and this should be our 5 function calls. And let's go back to the terminal and we type out Python 3 or 3.6 followed by the name of the Python file, so exercise19.py. And now we can basically see we have those 10 print statements here. So first of all, we provided the number 1 and 9 as arguments, and that's being printed out. So 1 plus 9 equals 10, which is the sum of the two numbers. And then in the second line, we have here 2 and 3, which are added up. The third one is 1 plus 2, and 3 plus 7 is the input. So 3 plus 10, and that's 13. And in a similar way, we have the other input here. And here in the bottom 5 statements, we are basically using those 2 variables So number 1 and number 2 as the variables. Here we are using that to calculate 3 plus 8 equals 11. And for example, here at the very end, number 1 plus number 1 plus number 2. So that would be 3 plus 8, which would be 14, plus 31 plus 2, so plus 33, and that would equal to 47. And that's how we can basically use our functions to use it with different arguments, and we can pass that as directly as integers, as numbers, as variables, or by using math, by combining, by adding, for example, or subtracting different numbers, and also by adding or subtracting variables or variables and numbers, for instance. So next, let's take a look at some common student questions. How can there possibly be 10 different ways to run a function? So believe it or not, there's a theoretically infinite number of ways to call any function. See how creative you can get with functions, variables, and input from a user. So the reason there's an infinite number of ways to call a function is because, of course, we can, in a lot of cases, pass basically an infinite amount of different arguments to it. So in our case here, for example, for the function to add two numbers, we can basically add any number here as an argument. So there's an infinite amount of possible values that we can work with. So next question, is there a way to analyze what this function is doing so I can understand it better? So there are many different ways, but try putting an English comment above each line, which we did before here, describing what the line does. Another trick is to read the code out loud, to really verbalize what we are doing. And yet another way is to print the code out and draw on the paper with pictures and comments showing what's going on. So especially if a function or if a program gets very complex, that might be really helpful to draw it out and to visualize like what's going on and how we call a function, for example, what's happening. So we may, for example, use a function call here, and then we may draw out like that the first argument here, 3 plus 2, is actually the first input here. We could, for example, draw a little arrow to number 1, and to make clear that we pass the sum here, 2 plus 3, into number 1, and then we use it inside of the function. What if I want to ask the user for the number of cheese and crackers? So in that case, we need to use int to convert our input from a string to an integer. And we can use input, the input function that we learned about in some of the previous exercises, to actually collect some input from a user. But it's important that if we use input, what we would get back from the user is actually a string. And in order to do some calculation with it, we need to convert it back into an integer. And then we can, for example, add two numbers together, as we did here in our first function that we wrote. Does making the variable amount of cheese change the variable cheese count in the function? No, those variables are separate and live outside the function. They are then passed to the function, and temporary versions are made just for the function's run. When the function exits, these temporary variables go away and everything keeps working. Keep going in the book, and this should become clearer. So if we just briefly comment out our second function that we wrote here, and we take a look at the previous code. As such, we can see that we used cheese count up here, for example, and amount of cheese, and we passed that to our function here. And when we provide a value of 10, for example, to this function here, that actually doesn't change anything else going forward. So that would just be the value that we work with here. So that would, amount of cheese itself would not change this argument here, or this parameter here that we use to define the function. That would just be the value that we pass to it when we do some calculations with our function. Is it bad to have global variables like amount of cheese with the same name as function variables? Yes, it's actually bad, because we may not be quite sure which one we are talking about. But sometimes it's necessary to use the same name, or it might be by accident. But in order to make it as clear as possible, we should be pretty clear. So if we define some variables, they should typically be named different from what we use within our functions. Is there a limit to the number of arguments a function can have? So that really depends on the version of Python and the computer we are using, but it's a fairly large number. In terms of best practices, there should be no more than 5 arguments that we pass to a function, because after that it can be quite annoying to use. And in the previous exercise, actually, we saw a way how we can use an asterisk followed by the name of the argument that we define, on the name of the parameter inside the function, which allows us to basically add any number of arguments or to provide any number of arguments to our function. So that may be one workaround that we can use in this case. Can we call a function within a function? Yes, it's possible, and we're going to see that later when we make a game in one of the later exercises. So these are the questions, the frequently asked questions in terms of this particular chapter. So that's the end of this exercise, exercise 19, and see you guys in the next video where we're going to focus on exercise 20.